Hi, this is David Unsworth, English editor of the Pan Am Post. Today we'll be speaking with Lawrence Reed, president of the Foundation for Economic Education in Atlanta. Reed holds a BA in economics from Grove City College, an MA in history from Slippery Rock University of Pennsylvania, and has taught economics at Northwood University. He's also worked as a journalist, served in the administration of former Michigan Governor John Engler, and headed the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's widely regarded as one of the leading figures in the libertarian movement and the Austrian School of Economics today. Lawrence, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, it's a pleasure, David. Thank you.
In today's climate of political correctness on college campuses, attacks on free speech by the left are becoming increasingly common. Tell us about what happened at the University of Colorado, Denver, when you were invited to deliver a lecture on Roman history.
I'd be happy to. This occurred in April of this year, 2017, and I was invited by a local chapter of the Turning Point student organization, which is a national group, and the campus was the University of Colorado at Denver, and my topic was lessons from ancient Rome, and it became apparent within 5 minutes that there was a group of students, I think probably around 15 or so, who were not interested in anything I had to say, but came there specifically because they intended to disrupt it and try to prevent my saying whatever it was I wanted to say. 5 minutes into the lecture, I was still talking about ancient Roman history. There was not a thing that you'd think would be controversial. But they started shouting. They started insisting that they speak, that they ask questions. And I said, let me get through my talk, please, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. And at one point, to one student who was especially persistent, I said, sir, I'll get to you first when we open it up to the Q&A. But that continued throughout the talk, and other disruptions like holding up signs that I can't repeat on air. They were really an unruly bunch of rude, spoiled brats. And it was quite, to me, I was quite taken aback. I'd never seen this before. It was small potatoes compared to some of the more notable recent events involving.
And as you noted, hardly a controversial topic, not as if you were discussing immigration or abortion or gay rights or, I mean, this is ancient Roman history. One would shudder to think what would happen if these social justice warrior types had been there for a lecture for a controversial topic. Yeah, and I was being called a racist, and there was no race content whatever to the talk. So they came with the idea of they were going to disrupt it one way or the other. And I don't know that it was because they knew me or anything about my background. It may have been nothing more than they didn't like Turning Point, which has a reputation of being a conservative and libertarian organization. So they may have just come with the idea of disrupting whoever the speaker was. Now, tell us about what happened. You wrote about this in an article you published recently. Tell us about what happened when you discussed the infrastructure in the Roman Empire.
Yes, I made the point in the lecture when I was going into some detail about how incredibly immense the Roman Empire was in both its size and achievement. And I said the Roman road building campaign that put roads down as far as what we now call Egypt and in Great Britain was so substantial that it would not be eclipsed until the 1950s. And at that point, one student just blurted out, "That's wrong." And I said, "Excuse me?" And he said, "The Mayans built more roads." And I said, "Mayans?" And I knew enough Mayan history to be able to say, I can tell you that the entire Mayan Empire, not just the roads, but the entire Mayan Empire could be fit into half of the Roman province of Egypt. Their road building was perhaps impressive on some scale, but it did not come anywhere near what the Romans did. But he continued to object and said that his professors have researched this, so he was suggesting that he got that information from his professors.
And as
I thought about this. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was, as you noted in the article as well, even the Incan Empire, who built more roads, they're estimated to have built 25,000 miles of roads. The Roman Empire built 250,000 miles of roads.
That's right, and the Inca roads were much greater in magnitude than anything the Mayans did. So I analyzed this afterwards in my own mind. At the time, I just couldn't understand why he would be making such a false point. But I think it's because the Mayans are thought of in leftist orthodoxy as indigenous native peoples who were victimized by white Europeans. So, you know, we have to elevate them to some kind of special status, and the white Europeans, of course, have to be condemned without any hesitation. So Romans are white Europeans, so we can't say anything good about them. I think that's the mentality that was behind it, which is, you know, political correctness to an extreme.
And it's troubling that a college student would take something like this so personally. It's almost as if he took it as a personal insult when the objective of your lecture was certainly in no way, shape, or form to denigrate Mesoamerican or South American civilizations. I mean, it's hardly the least bit offensive just to do a statistical comparison of their infrastructures.
Yeah,
I mean,
they are so. When I say they, I mean these campus far left progressive students. They are so easily offended that their very reaction becomes offensive, and they don't see the irony of it themselves at all.
Now, this past week at Evergreen State College, a biology professor named Bret Weinstein was accosted by an angry mob demanding his resignation. His offense? He objected to a so-called day of absence in which white students and faculty were asked to leave the campus. Now, in previous incarnations of this event, minority students voluntarily left the campus to attend discussions and workshops. And Bret Weinstein is no right-wing Republican or anything like that. He describes himself as a progressive. But I'd like to read his quote here because I think it's important for people to hear what he wrote. Quote, "There is a huge difference between a group or coalition deciding to voluntarily absent themselves from a shared space in order to highlight their vital and underappreciated roles, and a group encouraging another group to go away. The first is a forceful call to consciousness, which is, of course, crippling to the logic of oppression. The second is a show of force and an act of oppression in and of itself." So what can we expect to see this kind of thing spread across college campuses in the future? I mean, anyone who speaks up against this mentality is going to be shouted down by angry mobs?
Well, I'm guessing this whole thing has a ways to go before it gets turned around, in part because the reaction of so many administrations is to cower in front of these thugs. Look at Evergreen. The president, although he refused to fire the professor that the students were demanding the resignation of, he did give in and say, well, we'll have mandatory cultural retraining for all faculty members and the campus police. Giving in to these kinds of ridiculous demands only will encourage it more. Instead, what he should have been doing is taking names and expelling the students whose very actions were disrupting the process of education that lots of other students were paying good money for. This shouldn't be tolerated for a second.
I mean, you almost have to. There's several videos circulating now on YouTube and social media and so forth. I mean, you almost have to feel bad for this guy George Bridges, but he has all the backbone of a jellyfish. I mean, he's bending over backwards to these petulant students, and it's still not enough for them. And what I noted in an article I wrote, the level of disrespect that these students have been treating their university president with, I mean, it's astounding. I mean,
yeah,
what are these people going to do when they get to the workplace one day? If something doesn't go their way, are they going to barricade themselves in the CEO's office and make a list of grievances? I mean,
well, some of them, maybe many of them, will probably get the first real education of their lives when they go out into the job market and realize that they're going to be unemployed or underemployed if they don't change their behavior. I shudder to think what some of these kids are going to discover in later life when they face reality. I mean, this is a bubble on these campuses where they think they can get away with almost anything and have a completely distorted view of the real world.
Now, at my college, we had student activism, but it certainly did not approach these levels, and I can't imagine people treating our college president with this level of disrespect. Then again, this was 12 years ago, and it perhaps was not such a polarizing time in our national political discourse. Two other incidents that I don't know if you have heard of or not. At Bowdoin College in Maine, students hosted
I've not heard of that one.
This was last year. Students hosted a Cinco de Mayo party featuring Mexican food, tequila, and sombreros. In fact, the host of the party was a Colombian student. They were subsequently expelled from student government, banned from living in student housing, and made to apologize for it. The idea being that they were cultural appropriation. They were misappropriating Mexican culture. At Oberlin College, students protested misappropriation. This one is almost too hard to believe. Some Asian students found the Vietnamese sandwiches and sushi served in the campus cafeteria not to their liking, so they protested because it was cultural appropriation of their food. So what can we do? What can we do to fight back against these kind of people? What can we do to fight the campus activist crowd and the social justice warriors? And what can you do as a student or a faculty member or an administrator?
Well, I'm convinced, David, that most of this is coming not from the homes where the students have come from. They don't go to college with these ridiculous notions and with the intent to disrupt the education of others and to be so easily offended by just nothing. I think they get this once they're at college from a substantial and perhaps even growing number of far-left progressive professors who are the high priests of this whole movement. That's where the students, I think, are getting it. And so if we want to fix it, universities have got to stop hiring these kinds of people, and they've got to commit themselves to some real intellectual diversity on campus instead of stacking the deck with these nutcases that are giving these students these crazy ideas.
I recently read a study that showed that a generation or two ago, when say my parents were in college, the professors of a left-leaning bent outnumbered those of a right-leaning bent about 5-1. The study found that today that's more 20-1. So, I mean, even at many colleges and universities, even if you're just kind of a mainstream Democrat, you're still even in the minority. I mean, I think the situation is, I think the situation at some of these small liberal arts colleges is even more extreme than it would be at universities. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is you head up the Foundation for Economic Education, which is am I correct in saying it's the oldest libertarian think tank in the United States?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, one of the most troubling things we've seen during the past election cycle was the star appeal, let's say, of Bernie Sanders, a 74-year-old socialist from Vermont who did phenomenally well with the millennial 18 to 35-year-old crowd. And most of his proposals are hardly rooted in reality, particularly considering that we're $19 trillion in debt. I mean, what can we do to fight back against this on college campuses, this social justice mentality and this mentality that human beings are entitled to, a cradle-to-grave welfare state and all these free things like education and healthcare and housing and so forth?
Well, this is the very challenge we face at FEE every day, and we're trying to combat this scourge, this intellectual scourge that's taking place on so many campuses by reaching right around hostile teachers and administrators and professors and going right to the students. Our website is now gathering about 2 million unique visitors each month with some very good video and other print content. And I think that those of us who believe that in ideas of individual liberty and free markets and and private property, things like that, we have to get better at reaching young people at an earlier age, in high school and in college. And I think if we do that, we can at least give the students an alternative before they get to so many of these campuses where they hear a monopoly of viewpoints. But I also think that parents and legislators have got to stop throwing money at these institutions that are doing such a terrible job at giving students some intellectual diversity on campuses. When the dollars stop flowing, there'll be some changes. Until then, groups like mine will continue to try to educate students, but the other side is getting an awful lot of funding by the taxpayer, and that's what needs to be turned off to wake some of these people up.
That we really can't be too surprised at Evergreen State College, where the student body selected Mumia Abu Jabal as their commencement speaker, a convicted cop killer. But I think what's really troubling too is just that popular culture is so dominated by the left, and free market perspectives are rarely heard. One thing that was encouraging recently was the winner of the Miss USA pageant, who was asked whether healthcare was a right or a privilege, and had the audacity to say that healthcare was a privilege, and received heaps of abuse for it on social media. Did you see that story?
Oh, yes, I did, and just underscores the intolerance and the intellectual monopoly that so many students are subjected to. They're completely hostile to the very notion that something like healthcare, it might be a privilege instead of a right. They don't even know the arguments for the position that she expressed.
Finally, what can we do to reclaim the moral high ground? Because the left is so good at hijacking the moral high ground and saying that, well, you're incredibly selfish if you don't believe that all of these things are rights, that every human being is entitled to them. What can we do to reclaim the moral high ground here?
I think, David, that it's a long-term educational battle, and in many cases we've got to undo the miseducation that students have been subjected to. We've got to explain, for instance, on the very matter you raised, what the nature of rights is. That rights aren't simply needs or wants or desires. It's a much more complicated concept than that. And certainly America's founders knew what rights were, and yet their concept of rights is not even taught typically in so many colleges these days. So it's an educational battle. It's not going to come from government or government schools, I think, for the most part. This is an educational effort that has to be mounted by parents, by private schools, by institutions like mine and others who will try to undo the harm that has been happening for so long in mostly government education.
And are you in, I would imagine you're in touch with, most colleges and universities now have a college libertarians group, and from what I've seen, those do appear to be growing. That is an encouraging sign. We can at least take some comfort in that, I suppose.
Oh, yes. We are collaborating, partnering with student pro-freedom groups. Sometimes they're libertarian, sometimes conservative, but they exist on campuses across the country, and some of the best groups are Students for Liberty, Young Americans for Liberty, Turning Point is another, Young America's Foundation. So there is a presence, but many of these students feel constantly intimidated and threatened by these hooligans of the left. So they need our support more than ever.
Sure, by all means. And here in Columbia as well, where I'm based, we also have a strong Students for Liberty movement, which is a very encouraging sign. We've been speaking with Lawrence Reed, president of the Foundation for Economic Education. Lawrence, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, David.
Take care.